Let's talk about the debacle that is the Australian government's current attempt to hike taxes. Their monumental tax grab that ultimately is going to make us all poorer. That is, it's going to create a lot of deadweight loss. It's going to harm investors relative to the status quo ex ante, but it also is not clear that it's going to increase government revenue because investor behaviour will change. And investor behaviour is going to change to try to reduce the negative impact of the changes on themselves, but in so doing, they also end up poorer. So we all end up being worse off. Investors investing less and generating less growth, and therefore the government getting less long-term revenue and less growth in the economy. Now, there has been recently a Senate inquiry into the government's tax grab. This tax grab, I'll note, is something the government said they would not do in the 2025 election. But they clearly lied to us and now decided to hike taxes. I say they lied to us because they first initiated an inquiry into hiking capital gains tax in early 2025. And you can't tell me that circumstances changed within only 6 months of the election. And notably, that inquiry preceded what was happening with the Strait of Hormuz. So clearly they lied to us in 2025 to get elected, and then after having gotten elected, they decided to just shaft investors with their tax grab. Still, they were holding a Senate inquiry into this. Now, contemporaneous with this Senate inquiry, Wilson Asset Management held an event right next door to where the Senate inquiry was itself being held. And I appeared at that event. And here's what I had to say about the government's tax grab. It's been an interesting excursion looking at the decision to hike capital gains tax, particularly through the lens of someone with both an academic background, but also someone who's founded my own small business. And what I'd lead with is I don't know a single finance or economics professor or academic who supports these changes. There's no economic rationale for them. And the main reason for this is that by hiking capital gains tax in this manner, what the government has effectively done is it's expropriating half of all of your investments. It's expropriating half of all small business. And it's easy to see what that does. That reduces incentives to go out and invest. It reduces incentives to go out and found your own company. And what happens when that occurs? You get less economic growth. So when you get less growth, you get less future tax revenue. So what does this tax therefore mean? It's a recipe for trying to divide up a shrinking economic pie rather than grow the economic pie. And this means that whereas it's been estimated that maybe the tax might raise $77 billion, maybe, indeed one might anticipate it could raise much less money, making all of us poorer. In essence, it creates a deadweight loss. The investors and founders end up being worse off because they get less money, but also the government and future generations end up worse off because there's less growth. You get a deadweight loss. So this ultimately ends up being bad for everyone. And this means that the capital gains tax hike is not necessarily even going to raise more revenue. So we see this in the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom tried to raise capital gains tax, raising it to 24%. Now, 24% is notably below what the government wants to bring in at the moment. And capital gains tax revenue decreased. So it decreased between 10 and 18% depending on the figures you're looking at. This means that just raising the tax rate won't result in more revenue necessarily, but will also result in people having less opportunity. Because let's face it, younger generations, so my younger brother, for example, would have less opportunity to be able to build their own independent wealth. For those of us, I'm in my 40s now, for those of us who have been able to build some of this already, we're less badly affected. But for people who want to build a business in the future, well, what's the incentive when you're giving up half of that to the government? And this is a major problem going forward, and something that I don't think the government has properly grappled with. So clearly my views are that this should not go ahead. Now, I actually appeared at the inquiry into capital gains tax in February. So the desire to hike CGT is not a new thing. The government wanted to do this a long time ago, hence why they had the inquiry all the way back at the beginning of the year. And this notably was before the Strait of Hormuz, before many of the conflicts and volatility we've got recently. So this is not a new thing. Circumstances have not changed materially so as to give rise to this being a good idea. Rather, that's what is being argued, to push through a law that is not actually going to help any of us or make us all poorer. And in essence, they haven't really asked any of us to vote on this. And that, I think, is a big problem. And those are my thoughts on why the capital gains tax hikes in particular shouldn't go ahead.
But you both said that sort of any economist would say these are going to be negative for Australian businesses. I know we say that, but then I was listening to a little bit of Saul Eslake yesterday, and there's been some various articles, and they're sort of not necessarily agreeing with your logic, or are they just using... I know economists are great in terms of working out how to spin the story. I mean, could you comment on that?
I won't be able to do as well, but you go.
You go, then we'll let you go.
All right.
I know you've got it at 10:30.
So there's been some economists who have supported some of the changes. Notably, you will not find a single finance academic who supports them. I've seen none of my colleagues support any of these changes. UNSW's chief economist doesn't support the changes. And you know who mysteriously was not invited to the inquiry? UNSW's chief economist. So you can see something happening here. Now, in terms of the actual models, there's a few models and a few ways of looking at this. There's an old model called the Cheney-Judd model. Has faced some criticism. They found the optimal capital gains tax rate was closer to zero. Now, it faced some criticism, and many people concluded thereafter the optimal capital gains tax rate is positive, but not 50%. You only get to 50% if you make really, really heavy assumptions. Specifically, the heavy assumption that investing and also business growth and, for example, renovating and building property doesn't generate growth in the form of employment, corporate income tax, sales tax. Growth in the economy generates future tax. So if you make some really heavy, unrealistic assumptions, you can get to the government's 50% tax rate. But you have to make some assumptions that simply don't stack up. Now, in terms of the rationale for this, you often hear people talking about trying to tax labour and capital the same. But let's face it, as people like Chris and Derek have talked about, you don't tax them the same because the risk is very asymmetrical. And as Richard Holden, UNSW's chief economist, also talked about, you tax capital materially less than labour for the reason that it has a very different risk profile. And also you're investing your already taxed income in those investments. So there is not really a strong rationale for this. There's nothing in the academic literature that would suggest something like the government is doing. So as you can see from my comments, I regard the government's tax grab as negative for everyone. Negative for investors, negative for the economy, negative for welfare overall, and negative for net government revenue going forward. Indeed, there is no situation that the literature backs what the government wants to do. The economic literature fundamentally disagrees with the government's decision to hike taxes in this manner. Indeed, according to my own modelling, you can only get anywhere vaguely approaching what the government is doing if you make significant and unrealistic assumptions. Those unrealistic assumptions include A, the investors can't shift their capital to some other tax-advantaged investment, which could include a mortgage offset account on your own owner-occupied property, which notably gives you a tax-free and risk-free return by putting your money into that mortgage offset account. Similarly, investing your own owner-occupied property has no capital gains tax on it at all, so clearly there's an incentive to just shift all of your money into owner-occupied property. That is just one of many examples. Furthermore, the government makes an incredibly unrealistic assumption about the impact of investment on economic growth. It is well documented that investment in the economy, whether it be in startups or in mature companies or in property, generates economic growth. And I say it's growth across all of those fields. Direct investment in an initial startup generates growth because you are backing a company that is generating something innovative or at least something new. Secondary investment in listed shares or secondary unlisted shares also contributes to this because you need a liquid secondary market in order to facilitate that primary market. If you can't go around and sell your shares that you got in the beginning, well then these shares are not really worth very much. So you need that effective secondary market as well. Similarly, this applies to property, because if you want property to be created in the primary market, so that is new developments, you need a strong and liquid secondary market so as to incentivize people to invest in that initial investment. So it applies mutatis mutandis to property as it does to shares. That notwithstanding, when you have more investment in investments, shares, property, that type of thing, you generate more economic growth, which in turn has ancillary effects for the economy. It generates additional economic welfare, but itself generates more tax revenue by growing the economy. Think about it this way. When you grow a company, you've got more corporate income tax, you've got payroll tax, you've got the myriad taxes the company pays when it's going out and selling things or buying things. You have a whole lot of things that are accrued with the company growing. So when you incorporate that growth effect, it's impossible to get a tax rate near what the government is doing in any way supported by the modelling. And this includes in my own modelling where I've gone through this. I can only get to a rate vaguely resembling the 47% the government wants if I assume that A, investment does not generate growth, and B, investors cannot shift their investment into something that is tax advantaged, such as the owner-occupied property. Relax either assumption, and the government's 47% tax rate is far too high. And it's not just my modelling, there's other modelling all the way dating back to the 1980s that shows very similar things. For example, the Chamberlain-Judd literature and its streams of other additional amendments indicates the capital gains taxes optimally can tend toward 0%. Now, of course, that relies itself on assumptions, but what you're seeing here is that a strand of literature that indicates capital gains taxes should be low to only weakly positive, possibly zero in some cases. And the government appears to have completely ignored this. And this is why the government's charade of a Senate inquiry is a massive problem. If they're not in any way examined the empirical or theoretical literature into this, and this is why the government is going to make a terrible decision. Notably, the government has somewhat backed down on some of its moves. For example, they seem to be relenting on increased capital gains taxes for startups, but not for necessarily investors in some of those startups or unlisted companies. This is a big problem, because what they might do is enable investors at the very first round to maybe get a tax advantage. But what about later rounds? Because a company needs to keep growing over time, and if it can't get more capital to keep growing, well then it just peters out, so you get less growth. By the government trying to cherry pick and focus on this small tech group, obviously we end up with a lack of investment. Similarly, if we look at this just in small businesses, for example, say one sets up a flower shop or something like that, well that generates growth. That flower shop needs to go and buy supplies, it needs to employ people. It also pays corporate income tax. You've got a whole lot of things that exist outside of the tech sector that are beneficial for the economy. And that's something the government has obviously ignored. Again, a massive problem. It is good that they've relented somewhat on their tax policy. But I will note that Jim Chalmers initially said that the complaints about his tax policy were a scare campaign, or just scaremongering, or just partisan. So we know exactly what Anthony Albanese and Jim Chalmers want to do. It's just that the backlash was so great, they've been forced to somewhat capitulate, and even then, only slightly. And this means they could easily come and revisit this if they were to be re-elected. After all, they lied to us to get elected in 2025. Why wouldn't they just lie again? I'm not sure why we should trust them now when it's been shown that they are inherently untrustworthy. Now, they do appear to be trying to relent a little bit on taxes on testamentary trusts. A testamentary trust is a trust you set up when you are passing away so that you can distribute your assets to your kids or to causes or various other things. Those testamentary trusts were going to be hit with a 30% minimum tax on their distributions. It appears they might be relenting on this. But what about other trusts that you are setting up while you are alive? Why is it that those are being hit with a minimum 30% tax rate? It's frankly absurd. The government is just trying to grab more tax, but by focusing myopically on tax right now, today, they are ignoring the incentive effects of a lower tax regime and going out and investing more, generating more growth, more startups. And in so doing, what they're being is being myopic, short-sighted, focusing on revenue today only, ignoring investor behavior going forward, and ignoring what this means for future economic growth and total economic welfare. Which is why the government's decision and attempt to hike capital gains tax overall is a schmozzle. Their decision to slightly relent, in my opinion, is too little too late. Their capitulation does not go far enough. Their budget needs to be scrapped entirely. There are no redeeming features whatsoever about what the government is doing. It needs to be completely removed. And any of these changes need to be taken to an election. Because even if you happen to agree with their changes, and that's a big if, because I think their changes are fundamentally negative, not just for the economy, but for tax revenue over the long term. Even if you agree with those changes, do we want to set a precedent where politicians can lie about such massive things to get elected, then simply change their mind or change their position? I think that's an incredibly troubling precedent. The coalition has done this on smaller things in the past, for example, things such as ABC and SBS funding. But I'll note those are much less significant than fundamental increases to the amount of tax or the tax rate people are going to face. i.e., it's a very different thing to mislead people about whether you're going to keep funding the ABC versus misleading people about the amount of tax they're going to pay. They are very different things, and they are an order of magnitude different in severity. And if we make it allowed, if we make it acceptable for politicians to lie about such things and not take their change of mind to an election, then I think that bodes terribly for our democracy. And think about it this way. John Howard did change his mind about GST. But you know what John Howard did? He took it to an election. Now, John Howard has been criticised for not taking his firearms controls to an election. And of course, there are arguments about whether he should have taken that to an election. One could argue that maybe he should have given the voters a vote on that one as well. But at least he gave people a vote on the GST, which is significantly better than Jim Chalmers and Anthony Albanese, who have not given voters a vote on their tax changes. Rather, they're trying to ram them through after having lied to us to get elected. I think that sets a terrible precedent, and that alone is a reason to reject the bill and at least force them to take it to a vote at the next federal election. Not only is it bad policy, not only have they changed their mind on this bad policy, they've done so for a bad reason. They lied to us, and they lied to us to make us all poorer. And that's something that we should all be concerned about. But you can let me know your thoughts about it in the comments below.